A Bowery Boy. Are you ready?
Ooh, yeah.
Okay. That you can read on your own. We're going to go ahead and dive right in. Chapter 1, page 1, A Bowery Boy. As he set the hat box on a crate beside him, Charley Quinn heard the words in his head. If you ever got to fight alone, Charley, me lad, get your back to the wall. Right now, it was as if his older brother Johnny had spoken to him. His words flashed through Charley's mind as the thick-set boy, a member of the Dead Rabbits gang, walked menacingly toward him through the cool March rain of early dusk. Carefully, 12-year-old Charley stepped backward to the brick wall, his feet planted firmly in the mud of the Bowery alley, his fists raised and ready the way Johnny had taught him. This was how the best, most famous boxers in New York City fought. Johnny had known all about them. He had even met a few in saloons. Before he'd gone off to war at 23, he'd been the best street fighter in the Bowery and chief of the Bowery Boys gang. Charley's eyes bored into the dimness of the dirty alley, looking for help from one of the other Bowery boys. There was no chance of aid from his brother, Johnny Quinn, who had fought bravely against the Dead Rabbits in the great fight of 1857. Handsome Johnny lay now under the earth in Pennsylvania at a place called Gettysburg. Off to be a soldier, he had died last year, falling with the other heroes of the 140th New York Veteran Volunteers. Charley knew, too, that there'd be no help from the other members of his gang. He had left them 10 minutes ago at one of the new shooting galleries the Bowery boasted. Why hadn't he stayed longer with them and let his sister wait a bit more? Now he'd been caught by a prowling dead rabbit, alone and weary from hours of dodging the dangerous horse-drawn omnibuses on Broadway. This would be a 1-to-1 fight, because no other members of the Dead Rabbits gang were around either. Well, that was good. He had no fear of a one-on-one fight. The Dead Rabbit spoke first, raising his voice over the roar of the busy Broadway a few streets away. A Bowery boy, ain't ya? You wouldn't be here if you wasn't. You bet, Charley cried, and I can tell from the red stripes on your breeches that you're a Dead Rabbit. What are you doing here? I'm passing through. I'd be Tom Bailey from Mott Street. You want to fight? Charley replied. Are you planning on fighting me with a knife? If you are, I'll tell you I got one too, and it's sharp enough to suit me. The Dead Rabbit scoffed. My fist'll do tonight. That's plenty of the likes of you no-good Irisher. Come and try this Irisher, was Charley's taunt. Come and try me, Tom Bailey. The Dead Rabbit took the challenge. Running forward, he flung himself at Charley, his fists flailing wildly. Coolly, as Johnny had taught him, Charley ducked the first punches, catching those meant for his face on his forearms and swinging shoulders. Then, when Tom, in his rush, had gone too far off balance, Charley came in under this guard with a hard left to the side of his head, followed by a harder right to his nose. Howling, Tom fell back, holding his nose, now streaming with blood. The Dead Rabbit wasn't through, though. He came charging back at Charley, fighting more warily now. One of his punches landed on Charley's left eye and another on his cheek. Charley groaned, not from the pain he felt, but for what Noreen Quinn and Mr. Demarest would say when they saw his bruised face. He'd hoped to win this fight unmarked. Angry now, Charley sailed into the Dead Rabbit, punching hard and kicking too, because when the two gangs clashed, they didn't fight by any rules. One of Charley's feet shot out behind Tom's left one and hooked it. Surging backward, he brought the Dead Rabbit down and leapt on him as he lay on his back in a large, shallow mud puddle. Straddling Tom Bailey, aware that he was getting the knees of his best trousers wet and muddy, Charley gestured with his fist and asked, Have you had enough of me for now? Yeah, I've had enough. And just then, a loud, deep, masculine voice called out, I think you've both had enough. And Charley felt a strong hand pluck him off the Dead Rabbit and set him onto his feet. You run, the man ordered Tom. "And don't let me see you here again. You hear?" Tom got up swiftly, his nose still bleeding. He glared at Charley, and the huge policeman had fled down the alley. "Let me go!" squawked Charley, as the big Irishman in the long blue coat and the gold-painted helmet held him up, his feet swinging. The Metropolitan, that's another word for policeman, the Metropolitan only laughed. Suddenly, he let the boy fall to a crouch in the mire. He said, "I've seen you before. You're with Noreen Quinn. You have the look of each other, the Quinn look, the red hair, the pale face, and the eyes of blue." Panting, Charley nodded. "Yes, I'd be your brother. And fighting, too. That was a dead rabbit ran away just now. So you'd be a Bowery boy." It was the wisest thing to not admit the truth. So Charley muttered, "I don't belong to any gang." "A likely story. I know you to be a Bowery boy, all right, the youngest one of all, even if you aren't wearing your red shirt now. I knew your brother Johnny Quinn before he went off to war and got himself killed at the Round Top. If he hadn't enlisted, he might have died in another scrap like the one in 57, between your gang and the rabbits. I saw it. It lasted long enough for your state militia to be called out to stop it. Hundreds of you there were." Wiping mud and rain from his face, Charley said nothing. The important thing now was to get away from the Metropolitan. What's the Metropolitan? The man knew too much about him. It was on the tip of his tongue to tell him that his brother never would have been killed in a street fight in New York. He had been too smart for that. But instead, Charley said, "You didn't arrest that dead rabbit, so you shouldn't take me in either." "I don't intend to." Charley breathed deep with relief. He turned to pick up the hat box and leave, but once more that hand reached out to collar him. The Metropolitan said, "I don't intend to arrest ya, but I do intend to take you home to your sister." Now remember I told you about his sister, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. "I was going there anyway. How do you know my sister?" demanded Charley. "I'd seen her and her young fellow Michael Demarest at Mass on Sundays." Remember what Mass is, right? Church for Catholics. I'd seen you there with her. One time it was, from walking my beat. I know she lives on Christie Street. So he noticed her. He'd only seen her once, and he noticed her. Wanting to be rid of the policeman as soon as possible, Charley started to move off when the big hand stopped him once more. "Just one more thing, young Quinn. Did you thieve that box you have with ya?" What box is he talking about? Perfect. Stung, the boy told him, "No, I didn't. It's my sister's. I work with her. I take the bonnet she trims to Jennings on Broadway and fetch back the untrimmed ones and the ribbons and the laces she needs from R.H. Macy's and Lord & Taylor's. Look in the box if you don't believe me. There's nothing there but bonnets." The Metropolitan laughed. "I believe you. I was but teasing. I spotted you afar with the hat box. Quite the little gent you looked. If I didn't know you better, I planned to deliver you home there before another dead rabbit's after you. Come along with me now." Held fast by the collar, Charley and the policeman paraded through the gaslit Bowery, past concert saloons, oyster houses, leather goods stores, grog shops, and dance halls filled with loud music and shrill laughter. The laughter from the many billiard parlors was deeper because women didn't go into them. The sharp crack of rifles struck his ears from the shooting galleries. What is that called? A crack? Oh, yeah, you guys are good. Inside, once he spied members of his gang, but their backs were turned to him, and they waited for their chance with the rifles. Johnny had been a fine shot at the shooting galleries, and Charley himself was doing better all the time. It wasn't fair that a rebel bullet gun had gotten his brother at Gettysburg before he fired off one shot himself. That one bullet had killed him. One shout of help from him, Charley knew, would bring some of his gang tumbling out to argue with the Metropolitan, but he didn't cry out to them. He was too embarrassed. How they'd laugh at him to see him almost dangling at the end of a policeman's arm, tripping along like a lady toe dancer. He knew he looked ridiculous. Whiskery men in top hats and long black cloaks and women in bright-colored hoop-skirt gowns laughed as they passed him. Soldiers in Union blue went by laughing too, with the hooves of horses drawing streetcars in rails, and noisy, iron-trimmed carriage wheels splashed more mud on him and his captor. The Metropolitan propelled Charley into the entryway of the two-story brown brick building, and up 2 flights of steps. He stopped at the door where the Quinns lived in 3 small, shabbily furnished rooms. Rap for me. Good. To Charley's dismay, it wasn't Noreen who opened the door, but the man she was pledged to marry. Tall, lean, black-haired Michael Demarest. Behind him, Charley could see his sister and another seamstress, her friend Mrs. O'Neill. Noreen rose from her sewing machine, looking alarmed. The hateful Mr. Demarest, in the cold way he had about him, asked, "Ah, Sergeant, what have you brought to my door?" His door. Anger grew high in Charley Quinn. This little dingy flat had been rented by his parents long ago when they first came from Ireland. His father had gone west to work on the canals when Charley had been a baby and had never been heard from again. His mother had died of consumption 5 years back, so there's a sickness that took her. It took her away from her health. But the Quinns had stayed on in the flat. Noreen, the oldest of them, all at 27, had paid the rent and bought most of the food with the money she earned from her skills with the needle. No one trimmed hats better or faster in the city. First Johnny, then Charley, had delivered bonnets for her. The policeman said with a deep rumbling chuckle, "I'd say in truth 'tis a drowned rat I have here. Might as well take him anyway." The hat box fell from his hand and squid across the floor as Charley was pushed to the floor to fall at his sister's feet. When he looked up into her black-fringed blue eyes, he saw pain and embarrassment there, and sad weariness too. She told the officer, "Thank you, sir, for fetching him home to me. I see he's been fighting. Is he hurt bad?" No, I'm not," growled Charley. "It was just fists." Michael Demarest mocked. "What, no pistols or clubs or knives this time? How many of you were there? 100 at least, I suppose?" Charley flared. "Just me and the rabbit. I wish it'd been more." He looked at the man with hatred. A clerk in a bank, that was all Demarest was. A pen pusher. He hadn't gone into the army when Johnny had, though his brother had expected him to. Demarest had weak eyes. Weak indeed. His glasses were thick, but not so thick that he hadn't spotted pretty Noreen Quinn at Mass 2 years ago and made her acquaintance with boldness. Demarest loved money, and Noreen made decent wages, more than she could have made working as a housemaid in a big house on Fifth Avenue where rich people lived. She took work into her own home, toiling far into the night at her sewing machine. The whir of its treadle had been a lullaby to Charley when he was very small. How could she marry this stingy stick of a man who considered a stroll in new and handsome Central Park or a ride on a horse-drawn omnibus a great treat to Noreen from him? If Johnny were alive, he'd put a stop to that. Noreen and Demarest had only been betrothed for 6 months. While Charley glared, the Metropolitan told Noreen, "The other lad was getting the worst of it. 'Tis only fair to say so." Charley got up and said to the policeman, "I thank you for telling her I was winning." He stood, watching as the man touched his fingers to his helmet brim with Noreen and a silent Mrs. O'Neill and closed the door behind him. In an instant, Noreen was on to Charley. In a fury, she cried, "Fighting again, are ya? You promised me, Charley Quinn, that you'd fight no more while you did errands for me. Look at ya. Those are your best clothes." Charley wiped his face with the torn sleeve in his black and white checked suit. He looked down at his high-buttoned boots, more brown now than black with alley mud, and at his filthy stockings and stained knee pants. He'd looked a Jim Dandy delivering bonnets to the milliners that day. He had been smiling and